Welcome, everybody, to another episode of RealAg Politics. Today's episode was recorded on October 5th, 2023. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. And boy, last week we relaunched the program. We had our season premiere, and the feedback was tremendous. We have more policy wonks out there than maybe I first thought, and it's fantastic. There's great stories to be shared when it comes to some of the ag policy issues that are happening in Canada. So really appreciate all the great feedback. On LinkedIn, we had a whole bunch of great support for the episode, and people really trying to chime in and say this is the kind of stuff that is really needed in the industry of agriculture in our country. So today we're going to follow it up with episode 2 for this season and really dive into some important issues for sure. We're going to be joined by Steve Pratte. He is the VP of Transportation and Biofuels with the Canadian Canola Growers Association. We're going to talk about an issue that was brought up by Dave Carey last week on the show, which is the rail review that is underway as of September. And it's pretty all-encompassing, and Steve's going to break down kind of what is that all about, what does it mean, what are the timelines, and what do we expect out of it. We'll also be joined today by Erin Gowriluk. She's the president of the Canada Grains Council. And Erin's going to talk about an issue that she's pretty concerned about, actually, and that's the fact that science and science can be really hijacked. We've really seen that, numerous examples, but she's concerned about regulatory pressure, regulatory changes happening that really don't have a science backing. And that is something that concerns Canada Grains Council, some of the stakeholders. She's going to talk about how that's an issue in Canada, but also abroad, the US, the EU, Asia, and that can have a real impact on, quite frankly, some of our trade relationships as well. So lots to dive in there. And we'll finish up today with Alanna Koch, farmer from Edenwold, Saskatchewan, well known in many ag policy circles across the country. And Alanna is somewhat worried about some new legislation coming down the pipe here at the back end of 2023 about replacement worker legislation. This would impact all federally regulated industries. The grain industry falls into that. Railways, of course, just to name a couple. And this is kind of a continuing trend and a vibe that we're seeing from the current federal government and the relationship and their coalition with the NDP when it comes to labor unions and sick days and work rest and those kinds of things. And she's got a lot of concerns and feels that it could have some ramifications all the way down to the farm gate. So we'll talk about that with Alanna. If you have any feedback on today's show, you're always welcome to provide your feedback. Love to hear from you, no matter where you are in Canada or beyond. You can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms. You can also call the RealAg feedback line. That number is 855-776-6147. Okay, let's get to it. You ready? I'm ready. Let's rock. Let's talk ag policy here today on RealAg Politics, and let's get to the show. Okay, let's start off RealAg Politics here this week. We're going to talk about transportation. Why not? Because that's an important policy topic for sure, especially when we look at the western side of the country. But transportation is important across the country. But pertaining to this issue, it is a rail review that is underway as of September. Here to break down some of the, the significance of it and what some of the details are is Steve Pratte. He is Senior Manager of Transportation and Biofuels for the CCGA based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Shaun.
Okay. What exactly encompasses a rail review? We heard about this from Dave Carey, your colleague at CCGA, last week here on RealAg Politics. What is the rail review?
Sure. So if you recall, back in November of 2022, the Minister of Transport had received the final report of the National Supply Chain Task Force that had been looking at supply chain issues across Canada for the previous, better part of a year. And in that, there's a bunch of recommendations, one of which was put in extended interswitching, and the government has done that through the Budget Implementation Act 2023. But then there's a whole bunch of other recommendations in there, in that report, that Transport Canada has picked up and wants to float out there and consult with stakeholders, railways, shippers, associations of all commodities, and obviously grain as well. So they're looking specifically at 8 issues as part of this review. Things that are for our grain sector interest, things such as maximum revenue entitlement, how to monitor interswitching, things around the grain plans that the railways have to annually report on, things like own motion powers of the CTA, of the Canadian Transportation Agency, and a few other things related to contracts and commercial matters. So it's a broad consultation, and it's all going to be wrapped up in November.
I was just thinking of the Grain Act review. Like, what is that? Like 30 years? What? So by November, great.
Yes. So the Transport Canada has floated this kind of discussion document that stakeholders have had for a couple of weeks. They're launching in-person consultations in several cities across Canada starting in the middle of October. I believe the last one's November 1st. All input from all stakeholders, including provinces and territories and whoever else wants to comment, are due by November 15th.
Steve, okay, I'm gonna the serious question here. I'm not trying to be like cynical and stuff like that. Are we taking this review seriously, or like that just that to me, like when you say that quick of a timeline being all encompassing those 8 points, are we not to, sorry the pun, but is this a situation where this review is railroaded?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're kind of very specific in the questions they're asking around certain aspects of these topics. But you're right, there's some fundamental policies and regulations there to our interests as a grain sector. And, being able to put together meaningful and, cogent input into this in the matter of a couple of weeks is challenging for stakeholders. So we're not sure, and Transport Canada doesn't really have a action plan of what's coming out of this. But obviously we're taking it seriously, as would be the railways and other sectors. So we're going to do our best as individual associations and as a sector working through the crop logistics working group to try to coordinate some kind of key middle of the road perspective on this.
Now, just learning from some other consultations that the government has done, they close this consult, they collect all of that feedback that will come from not just farm groups or the energy, like it's going to come from a wide, vast scope of stakeholders. And then they will provide like a what we heard document. Is that what the plan is?
As of right now, we've been told that they're going to go away, consider this over the winter, and come back with some sort of a framework, is the term that was used recently, that they will I don't know, is that like a menu of things they might look at in the future, or they'll come back to ask for more consultation, if you can believe it, on whatever their thinking is at the time. So there was no commitment to a what we heard report. This isn't a review that's tied to any kind of statutory obligation. This isn't something like the Canada Transportation Act review, which is in law on a periodic basis. This is Transport Canada kicking their tires around and just testing, I guess, some ideas around some of these issues and some of the concepts and things within those issues.
Yeah. It's like a brainstorming session. And when you ask for brainstorming, yes, you get a wide variety of thoughts. So I would think there'd be a little bit of a sort of lack of focus maybe when we look at some of this. Now, does CCGA look at this as an opportunity, or are we fighting to keep certain things that we already have?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, in general, good public policy should be looked at. It should be we have those conversations about it, especially with something like, for instance, maximum revenue entitlement. 23 years now in operation. I mean, we've had a couple public discussions about it over the years. They want to talk about certain aspects of it again. I don't think that's anything for our interest as a grain sector to be afraid of. We've got lots of great evidence, and a lot of these things, Shaun, it's kind of a rehashing of in various legislative consultations and whatnot. I mean, we have a lot of this information and data at our fingertips, so it's really just repackaging things for the consumption of Transport Canada at this time and tailored towards their specific questions. But you're right. There are things they're looking at here that are kind of foundational and fundamental, and there are things that I would call, administrative kind of trivia things and minor points, the grand scheme of things. So it really runs the gamut.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know the strength of the bench at Transport Canada, but in some ways I would expect that there's going to be some explaining in terms of like sort of the history lesson and how we why we have these things as we sort of question how we got to this point. For example, the MRE. There's a whole long lesson, or I guess history tale, in terms of why that was established. if we're, and I think you're right. If we do believe it's good policy, and some people do, some people don't, you have to be able to defend it, and going not just in the past, but also going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to that point at the outset of that comment about, that is the nature, pick your department, pick your issue. People come and go, in those federal departments. And, that's just life. And that's the kind of scenario we're in these type of roles as advocates and policy thinkers in our space. So that's part of the job too. You're right, is that kind of re-education, if not just flagging, some of the foundational underpinnings of why we have some of these issues in our sector.
Do you think there's any undercurrent of any of those 8 points that the government's really like? There's 8 points, but is there one of those points where we're like, okay, this is really a focus? It's sort of masked in the eight, so to speak.
No, I mean, they're all kind of given the same kind of airtime, if within the actual document, and they're really, at least the way that it's been articulated to us, is at these consultation sessions. Transport Canada's all ears, and if there's certain areas that certain groups want to focus on, i.e., if the grain sector's congregated in a particular session, we can drill into things. If we want to spend the whole time on the MRE, we can spend the whole time on the MRE. Like, we don't have to talk about some of these other ancillary issues.
Now, Steve, I mentioned at the beginning, transportation takes up a lot of the oxygen in Western Canada at some farm meetings. It's also very important. As I travel in Central Canada, Eastern Canada, and the Maritimes, I remember being in Atlantic Canada, and they're like, "We got transportation issues too." Is this for the entire country, or is there a Western Canadian focus here?
As far east as the actual consultations on this go that I'm aware of is Ottawa, but they also do have a virtual component. So there are people, you don't have to be necessarily located in Western Canada to participate in these.
But is it regarding policies that also impact the eastern side of the country, or is it only?
Oh, sure, yeah, like things around in contracts between shippers and railways of any commodity, within grain or outside of grain. There's stuff around the actual confidential contracts. There's things around administrative monetary penalties that the Transport Canada can use as basically a fine for non-compliance of transportation providers. There's things like final offer arbitration and other agency processes that shippers can use for rates and service. So there's some stuff there that's applicable to absolutely anyone who's using rail-based transportation in Canada. And there's a few things that are really specific to the grain sector's interests.
Okay, so to wrap up, if there was one, maybe two things that CCGA would like, if we view this as an opportunity, is there one or two things that you see that you're really gonna see this to push forward in this consult?
Yeah, the one thing I just draw attention to is, again, we've kind of referenced it a couple times here in our couple-minute discussion, but it's around the maximum revenue entitlement. And part of that has to do with, you can read between the lines of the discussion document how the effectiveness of the railway lobby around regulatory protection of certain movements of grain and certain commodities has kind of infiltrated into this document. And we saw a lot of that with the Budget Implementation Act and extended interswitching debate in the House and the Senate committee study of that. A lot of strong positioning being thrown around and discussed by both sides, both to government and in public affairs, like in Ottawa, in papers and advertising and whatnot. So I would say the MRE is the critical one for CCGA and the grain sector at large, because with the MRE, that actually affects every Western Canadian farmer who's shipping through the structure of freight rates and the relationship between the grain shippers and the railways. So that one has broad-based application to all Western Canadian farmers.
Yeah, something I hear once in a while in the northern tier of the U.S. is the MRE is actually a trade deterrent, and should there be challenges to it at the WTO or the USMCA dispute resolution panels, that never really has caught fire. We've written stories about it, some of the commentary coming out of say some of the wheat groups in like NOG and U.S. Grains Council and things like that, but we just never really caught fire. So it'd be interesting to see if somebody argues from a trade perspective through this consult process on the MRE.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I mean, I know it's been those kind of sentiments have brewed up at times in the past. But certainly, I mean, the MRE, just as in its application, if there's American grain that's routed to Western Canadian port for export, it does, for the portion that travels in Canada, it does technically fall under the MRE, again, for that kind of reciprocity. But that type of movement doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, no, right. Exchange rate being a factor there. Hey, Steve, really appreciate this. This one we're gonna stay on. And hey, what the best part is by November 15th, we're gonna maybe have a little bit more to chat about
That's
when
true.
it comes to this. So thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Shaun.
Erin, welcome to RealAg Politics. It's great to chat with you again.
It's always a pleasure to connect with you, Shaun. Thank you for
Yeah. Well, it's great. I really appreciate you being here. And of course, Erin Gowriluk, president of Canada Grains Council. So, Erin, let's start off the top. I actually would like you to explain to the audience who is Canada Grains Council and what function does it have in the industry as a stakeholder?
Canada Grains Council has 41 individual members, Shaun, but we have representation from the entire grain value chain. So from producers to the grain companies, the exporters, the life science companies, processors, we have the entire value chain around one table. And I have since learned when I joined the organization 6 months ago, it turns out this is a pretty unique model. This doesn't exist in every jurisdiction, that you have this commitment to consensus building and collaboration. So that is Canada Grains Council. And in terms of the function or the role that it plays, I think it does two things quite effectively. We've created a forum for those internal discussions, a place for the entire sector to come together and have a conversation about where we may have a common understanding, or at least understand one another's perspectives on some issues where we know we may not be aligned. But then there's a real commitment, certainly on the part of the board, to build consensus and find alignment wherever possible, because we know that we're stronger together.
Yeah, I can imagine with naming some of those stakeholders, that not everybody is on the same page on all issues. So, but hey, that leads to what is the saying? Iron sharpens iron, or something like that. Like you probably provides some opportunity for some really, really good discussions to come to better solutions.
Yeah.
I think it's usually how that always goes. Okay, I want to talk to you today about some of the concerns, maybe in Canada as well as internationally, where there's regulatory pressures, and we always talk about science-based decision making, and it's kind of being a little bit left in the lurch for more political or emotional appeal. Why does this have you concerned?
Well, I think this has me concerned because we know that when we base decisions on science, we get one very favorable outcome, and that is that the policies that we establish are ultimately going to lead us in the right direction. They're going to get us closer to where we all want to go. When we bring the science and the data with us and we develop agri-environmental policies that are based on science, we're more likely to achieve our agri-environmental objectives, those targets that we've established. It's when we create these arbitrary targets that are not informed by the science, the data, that aren't going to get us any closer to where we want to go. It's a huge waste of time, and we continue to fuel the misconceptions around agriculture and the environment.
So if we know that's what's happening, why do we continue, and I say we as Canada and other countries around the world, continue to fall into this trap and make this mistake?
I think that look, I can't speak on behalf of government, but my observations would lead me to believe that governments can respond in one of two ways. They can use the science and the data, and they can clearly communicate the science and the data to their constituents, to consumers in their respective jurisdictions, to talk about the reasons why they've taken this decision. And they can speak to the robust scientific process that informs their ultimate decision. It's a more difficult decision to take. It's a more difficult path to take, but we know they're capable of it because we saw them do it during the pandemic, right? We had to lead with science first, and we had to explain to the public why the science was driving some of these policy decisions. The other option that governments can take, and that is they can leverage these misconceptions, I think sometimes in an effort to appear aligned with their own constituents. And in so doing, they fuel these misconceptions, and they ultimately, as I said, will end up building policies and programs around these myths and misconceptions that get us no further ahead. It's often the easier route to take to appear to be aligned with your constituents, and leverage the misinformation and their misunderstanding of the issues, but it doesn't typically lead us in the direction that's going to result in more meaningful policy.
So an example, as you're describing that very well, an example that I think of is Mexico's position on the trade dispute with the U.S. on white corn imports. The U.S. is, saying Mexico's making a decision here that is political, trying to align with some of the constituents instead of talking about the science. Is that a fair example that I'm coming up with there?
I think there are so many examples, Shaun. That's one of many right now. We can point to Mexico, we can point to the European Union, and we can point to our own backyard, where we've seen examples where the government will acquiesce under pressure from anti-agriculture or activist groups. And I think, when I reflect on, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago now that we had the North America EU Agriculture Conference in Prince Edward Island. I can't believe this was the first time in my 15 years in this industry that I really had an opportunity to spend time talking to American, Mexican, and European farmers. And I suppose I didn't have a full appreciation for what their perspective might be on some of these issues and some of these decisions that have been taken in Mexico, for example, and in the European Union. And there is not support from the farmer constituents. These farmers do not support the decisions, for the most part, that their governments have taken in the EU and in Mexico. Farmers recognize the challenges that this is going to present for farmers in Mexico and for some of the trade opportunities as well. And there's a level of frustration, certainly, with the government in the case of Mexico, and I don't understand Mexican politics to the extent that I can speak to that. But what I observed was a real frustration from farmers in Mexico because their government has not consulted with them. They don't have an understanding or an appreciation for the real impact that this is going to have on the profitability of Mexican farms and the impact it's going to have on rural economies. But I guess I was heartened to a certain extent to see that, you've got organizations and associations similar to what we have in Canada, for example, with the Grain Growers of Canada and the CFA, that are working on behalf of Mexican farmer interests, and Copa Cogeca in the European Union, for example, fighting on behalf of those farmers, trying to make inroads. So I don't pretend to understand the politics in Mexico, but their farmer constituents are certainly very frustrated with the direction in which these policies are going.
And to add on this, and we talk about the impacts, right? So we like to throw around the phrase unintended consequences when it comes to policy. And I think it's sometimes left out of the narrative when the regulatory lawmaker or people are coming up with some of these policies. They don't think of what happens next. They're very singularly focused. Is sort of always my thought. And this is where food security plays a role. And let's just use the example of nitrogen policy. There's a couple of European countries that this is of much concern, not only to the general public, but also to farmers. So there's farm profitability. But when we're talking about just food security, that becomes a real big problem, and that's left out of the conversation. I don't understand why.
It is left out of the conversation. And I have the same opinion that you do. These may be unintended consequences, but we can't pretend we don't know that this is going to be the impact of these decisions. We can't pretend we don't know. We know, for example, that the impact of the EU's Green Deal or the farm to fork strategy under the Green Deal, once implemented, is going to, depending on the commodity, result in a 24 to 25% decrease in overall production. We know that it's going to lead to an increase of up to or over 10% in the cost of food. That's on top of already record high prices. And that's just what's going to happen within Europe. Consider the consequences beyond Europe on the countries that rely on food from a region, which is going to see an overall decrease by 25% in production. Food is already becoming very unaffordable for many, even European constituents. Imagine what's going to happen under these policies. And we're not having that conversation to the extent that we should be. I recognize that we're facing a crisis with the climate, and that has to be addressed. But I mean, I don't mean to sound dramatic. It can't come at the cost of human lives. We have a responsibility to be talking about the impact that COVID, climate, and conflict are having right now on the global population.
Yeah, good point. Okay, now in this realm, this fall, I don't know if it's this month or next month, the EU is going to be making some decisions on glyphosate. And it kind of if you're a lot of times in sports, it's like, well, what does Vegas say? The odds, I know in a note you sent me, odds makers are kind of putting this at a 50-50, what could happen here. I know you're watching this with great interest.
We're watching it with great interest. And I'm going to tell you, we don't have to speculate because the decision is going to be out quite soon. It's mid-October that the final decision will be taken. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. We know, for example, this summer that EFSA, the European Food and Safety Authority, issued their assessment of glyphosate. And the European Commission responded to that assessment only about 2 weeks ago in a recommendation or a proposal that they put forward. And that proposal is that the EU adopt continued use of glyphosate for a period of 10 years. So the last time we had this conversation in Europe, it was 5 years ago. We're going to approach the deadline or the expiry date as of mid-December this year. And so their recommendation, based on the EFSA report, based on the scientific analysis, is that we see continued use of glyphosate in the European Union for a period of 10 years. Now, European member states will vote on that proposal, and they will do that in mid-October, and that's what we're waiting to see the results of. But I'm cautiously optimistic because I think this, in addition to the decision that they've taken with respect to gene editing, are giving us a few, I think, indications that increasingly they recognize the impact of some of these policy decisions, but also the important role that innovation plays in helping them to achieve some of these sustainability objectives that they've set.
In some ways, this inflationary environment has maybe assisted in people recognizing that, some of these things we've been arguing about for decades, it kind of a sober second thought. Is that a good way to put it when you think about this?
I hope so. If there can be a silver lining, I certainly know that more people are talking about food than ever before in light of the prices that we're paying at the grocery store. And that's here in Canada. And I understand from colleagues who have traveled to Europe, it's even more expensive in Europe. But when you look at an environmental proposal like Farm to Fork, for example, that I can't recall if it's by 2030 that they want to see 25% of their overall production move into organics. As a consumer, you can't help but think about, Sri Lanka is a bit of a dramatic case. But look, there's a case study for you in terms of what happens under those conditions when you see that much of a shift. And so hopefully people are pausing and thinking a bit about, what I'd said at the top, which is, are we really having the right conversations about climate change and the environment? Are we really thinking about the policies that we're putting in place? Are they going to get us any closer to where we really want to go?
Now, if the EU was to ban glyphosate, if that was a decision, there could be some trade impacts there for Canadian products and Canadian farming. We use glyphosate on things like burn off. I guess we have to wait for what some of the rules are, but there could be some real trade impacts on Canadian commodities going into the EU.
Well, and there would be, right? Like we can't speculate on the outcome of the decision that will be taken in 2 weeks. We'll know soon enough. But in the event that they were to ban glyphosate, for example, in 2024, they would be certainly having a conversation about import tolerances. And that would be really unfortunate because glyphosate has been an important tool for Canadian farmers in reaching some of their sustainability objectives. And so, from the conversations that you've had with Canadian farmers, they pride themselves on their track record with continuous improvement over generations and the sustainable practices, in particular in Western Canada, when I cite conservation tillage as one example, not possible without glyphosate. And so when you remove a tool like that from Canadian farmers, it's going to impact our ability to meet some of our own sustainability commitments. And so it would be a very short-sighted decision to take. And it's one that I hope they won't take. And I'm feeling quite optimistic that they're going to follow the science on this because we've seen positive results both from EFSA and I think with respect to the proposal from the European Commission. So I think in a couple of weeks, we'll get good news on this one, Shaun.
Erin, thanks a lot for your perspective. And once again, congratulations on your move to Canada Grains Council. Looking forward to future chats. Thanks so much.
Me too. Thanks, Shaun.
Let's continue on here with RealAg Politics. Our next guest is Alanna Koch, and she farms with her husband Jerry in Edenwold, Saskatchewan, just outside of Regina. Hey, Alanna, great to chat with you.
Thanks for having me on your show, Shaun.
Yeah, so this is a topic. I'm going to be honest. I've sort of swung I don't know if I even swung. I think it was a backward strike, if you want to put it in baseball terms. I've missed this. And this is an issue that's happening from that's why it's on RealAg Politics here, very much from a policy standpoint, where maybe we don't think of it as an ag issue, but it's got some real ag impacts, and it has to do with the labor front and some legislation that is on the books, and it's got you quite concerned. So talk about what the issue is.
Yeah, right, Shaun. Well, I think you're not the only one that maybe hasn't sort of been as aware of the issue as we should be. I am also one of those people, and it's just come to my attention. And so I'm really happy to be able to talk about it and hopefully get it on a whole bunch more radar for the ag community. So what it is we've already got some legislation that's come down from the federal government within the last year or less that has had an impact right through the supply chain. So one of it is a piece of legislation federally that was for work rest rules that has an impact on labor. The other one is some new sick days legislation that was meant to fill the gap where sick days weren't already being provided by federally regulated businesses. But in fact, the unions are interpreting sick days as stackable. So we've already got those that are impacting, capacity and, labor availability and the ability for management to deal with those issues. But now there's new legislation that the federal government is planning to bring in between now and the end of the calendar year that is banning replacement workers during strikes and work stoppages. So this has a huge, huge impact if we think about what that means for the supply chain, railways being one of them, ports another, that's what's going to hit agriculture. But I mean, it's for other federally regulated businesses too, airlines, telecommunications, banks. I mean, there's, I'm sure, many others, but serious concerns here.
Yeah. And at a time where, quite frankly, we got a really tight labor market. And so there's not exactly a whole bunch of supply of workers here to, backfill some of the supply gap because of some of this legislation. This seems very concerning.
Well, exactly right, Shaun. I mean, we know we've got a human resource shortage across every sector of our economy. And at a time when we're already dealing with labor shortages in that way, but also at a time when even the federal government has indicated they want to expand our trade, they want to have us grow our economy, despite maybe some of their sort of mixed signals policy-wise. We're trying to drive growth here and progress, and this is definitely counter to that. I mean, this takes us backwards. It creates, definitely capacity limiting, reputation damage, reliability issues. We already know what we deal with, for example, at the Port of Vancouver sometimes. This is going to make it even more complicated and worse. I mean, it's exactly opposite of what we need. If I was generous, I could say this maybe was well-intentioned policy with unintended consequences. The concern I have, Shaun, is I'm not sure it's even well-intentioned policy. I mean, it's a political move because of the power balance in Ottawa, where, the Liberal government has to depend on the NDP and their agreement that they struck with them in 2022 to remain in power, right? So this is obviously something that's come down because of political ideology, not because of what is good government policy.
And you mentioned the new legislation regarding replacement worker and the inability to do that. The Port of Vancouver is a great example. When they went on strike, management, so called it, backfilled some of that operational activity. That would no longer be possible.
That's right. That's what would be banned. So what we would see is, these destabilizing changes, making work stoppages even more difficult. We already know the supply chain is impacted during strikes and work stoppages, but we can keep things moving also from a safety perspective. If we think about loaded trains or loaded boats or, whatever it is that's going on in the supply chain, to bring it to a full stop and not allow any replacement workers to come in, and allow the supply chain, though somewhat disabled because of the work stoppage, to at least allow that flow to continue, that would be completely stopped. I mean, it's a disservice to people. It's a disservice to our economy. I think it has safety implications for the system. It's really devastating impact for agriculture, but beyond that, for the broader economy of the country.
Yeah, and like I said, as a farmer, you're pretty concerned about this. I know many in the industry and all the different stakeholders that would touch this. You have to be hearing some concern from them.
Well, again, because I am fresher to this than I should be, considering the fact that the federal government held consultations starting over, a year ago, I guess, where I guess that got quite a bit of pushback. And despite that, they're going to proceed this fall. Shame on me that it wasn't on my radar more. So yes, I've had some discussions, lots of concern. I'm going to have conversations with farm groups, industry groups, chambers of commerce. Apparently it's on provincial government's radar. I want to reach out to them, and I'm going to urge, farmers and industry leaders to all get on this, to say we're concerned and what can we do to stop it? What can we do to influence this, so that if there is some kind of legislation brought in, that it not be this draconian, that it not be this impactful. Why don't they look at other models? Apparently there's some US, railway legislation, which now they think, and it's been on the books, I think, for like almost 100 years, which allows during work stoppages to allow the supply chain to continue to operate as they take these work, sort of disruptions aside and work collaboratively, in a more collaborative way to resolve them, but allow the supply chain to function. I mean, we have to look at those kind of solutions rather than something like this.
Yeah. And, I think one of the, you're talking about this, one of the disconnects for me is sometimes in this country of Canada, we're really good at like saying we're going to, we're going to increase trade by this much. We're going to do this. We're going to have a stretch goal. And then we sort of lose attention. I don't know if we get sort of like, oh, there's a shiny thing over here, we get distracted or what it is, but we don't work back and think about all the things that need to happen in order for us to actually achieve that. We just set the goal and maybe, hope it works out. We'll see how we'll check back in 5 years, and we'll maybe set up another committee and we'll have a look at a deeper dive into it. You said consult. We're really good at consults, and we do those kinds of things. And this is, infrastructure investment is an example of that. And also I think labor is a component of that as well. And I think that I think that's concerning.
Oh, I mean, you've hit the nail right on the head there, Shaun. As I always say, policy matters. So, we can run around setting targets and lofty goals and talking about growth. And I think all of those are great opportunities for agriculture and the Canadian economy. And we should be setting targets, and we should be setting goals, and we should be thinking about all of those things as far as growing, our economy. And we have what the world needs. We should be taking advantage of that. But then we don't put any of the building blocks in place to make it happen, whether that be infrastructure, as you said, labor, policy, regulations. Like, we need to think about it in that kind of order, so that you actually implement changes to make things happen. And that is a very Canadian thing that we seem to do. We seem to have this really dysfunctional policy and regulatory mindset that, well, we can do whatever we want to do on that front. Politically, this works for us, so let's do that. But meanwhile, we should have the best trade results ever. Meanwhile, we should have this growth of the economy. Well, it doesn't work that way. Policy matters. In this case, this definitely matters if we think we're going to achieve any kind of growth or trade targets. Okay,
before we wrap up here, what give myself and the audience some help here. If people are concerned about this or they have some thoughts about it, what do they do? Do they talk to their MP, their farm groups? What do they do?
Well, I always say government's run by the people who show up. So I think we have to show up. I mean, I think maybe some were showing up to begin with, Shaun, but now is the time to really show up. So I definitely think they need to be thinking about talking to their MLA so that the provinces know this is on the radar and of a worry. For sure, you should be talking to your member of parliament. You know, you should be thinking about sending a letter to the federal minister of labor and probably the federal minister of agriculture. If you think about it from a farmer perspective, this is what we're worried about. We think this legislation is going to have devastating impact. Please don't proceed with it. Are there any other solutions? Can you look to other models around the world that might achieve some of what you're looking for, but doesn't have the damaging effect on the industry? And you should probably think about talking to your checkoff groups and find out what they're doing for you as well.
Yeah, good points indeed. One could only hope that the alliance between the Liberals and the NDP fall apart before this new replacement worker legislation. That's one where we're sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face, it would seem. Alanna, thanks a lot for joining me, and good luck with that completion of harvest. I know you're almost done, and then move on to some of that fall work. So all the best to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Shaun. Appreciate the opportunity.
I think today's episode of RealAg Politics really once again spoke to the need for people to participate. You got to show up. And it's easy to sort of say, you know what, I disagree. Why would I bother? It's not going to go the way I want. You got to participate. And, being in the room, showing up is absolutely critical. So we covered a lot of very important ground from an ag policy perspective. I'm super interested, going back to the original conversation there with Steve Pratte from CCGA, what really comes of this rail review? Such a tight timeline, not sure quite frankly what the rush is to have the consult done by November 15th so we can just hurry up and wait for that what we heard document. To me, I that's something we're going to really follow here and see what really transpires. And, Steve talked a lot about the MRE. That would be a fascinating discussion through the winter farm meetings in terms of how people feel. Should there be an MRE? Do we care about the MRE? Do we need it going forward? That would be a fascinating policy discussion, something that maybe will come up on a future episode of RealAg Radio or this show as well. So once again, if you do have any feedback or comments, we'd love to hear from you, of course. Email is shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the social media platforms or call the RealAg feedback line 855-776-6147. This show is all about it's called RealAg Politics. It's all about ag policy and the impact it has on this industry of agriculture. It's been a lot of fun. We're going to keep rolling here every single week. Make sure you check us out on YouTube, or of course you can always download the RealAg Politics podcast and keep that feedback coming. If there's topics that you think we need to explore and dive into, please reach out, suggest them, because there is lots to uncover here in the area of ag policy in Canada. So until next time, thanks so much for getting real and getting connected with Real Agriculture. We'll see you again next week. Cheers, everybody.